This is an important topic, guys, because we're going to talk about whether or not buying a house, your primary residence that you live in, is it an asset or a liability?
Okay, boy, I'm beating my best, I know. Feeling the buzz, living my life, dancing, let's make some noise.
So there's been this topic lately that's floating around about whether or not owning a home, your primary place of residence, is an asset or a liability. And luckily, I don't think it's gaining too much traction, or at least I hope it's not gaining too much traction, because most sensible people already know the answer to this question. Of course, your primary residence, owning real estate, owning your house, is an asset. So this whole conversation, this whole topic's been attributed to Grant Cardone, but in reality, it goes back a little bit further to Robert Kiyosaki when he wrote in his book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that your home, the house that you own, is actually a liability and not a good idea. And we're gonna get into a video. We'll watch Grant Cardone talk about why he thinks owning your primary residence is a bad idea. But before we get into that, I think it's useful for us to look at the actual textbook, the dictionary definition of what an asset is and what liability is. So the strict accounting and finance definition of an asset is a thing of value, simply put, and liability refers to a debt or an obligation. But I think where it becomes problematic is when we start assigning new definitions to these words, right? Like a lot of the people who are in the camp of your primary residence being a liability, they're qualifying an asset as needing to produce income. Their argument is that if an asset is not cash flowing, producing income, putting money in your pocket, it's not an asset. And that's simply not true. There is no prerequisite for an asset to produce income for it to be an asset. They're conflating the fact that most primary residences, most homes, have an underlying mortgage, right, that people are responsible for. That doesn't change it being an asset, except in very extreme circumstances where, a home, let's say a $100,000 house has a $200,000 mortgage on it or something like that, then you're underwater, right? You owe more on the home than what it's worth, and that's a whole nother story. But do not let anyone take you down that rabbit hole and tell you that it's a bad idea for you to own real estate. It's not. Guys, that ship already sailed decades ago. The amount of wealth that has been created by real estate, by people owning homes in the 40s and 50s, right after World War II, when all these programs came out that made it more affordable for people to own homes, and passing that equity from, fathers to sons to grandsons, and, people building wealth because of that. So the argument is kind of ludicrous, to be honest with you, but, we're going to dive into it a little more.
I have a property in Calabasas. I have a big, a nice house in Calabasas. I also have an apartment in New York City. I rent both of them. I don't own any property.
Yeah.
In terms of where I live. Here you are with a $1.2 billion net worth, and you don't own a house, a personal house.
Yeah, I rent my house.
Right.
I get a better loan on it because I rent it. I could own I could have a LLC own it and rent it back to me, and I'd still get a better deal. So, I rent where I live. I treat houses like hospitals. You get in, you get out.
Let's break down something he just said right there, and I touched on this, right? Which is that he doesn't have to own a home. Right? Like the guy's worth 1.2 billion, I think they said. At this point, he probably has dozens of different corporations. They own different properties, and he doesn't need to own anything. Grant Cardone, in his real estate portfolio, has a massive amount of rental properties and buildings. Like for those of you who don't know who Grant is, and by the way, this isn't a video tearing Grant down or an indictment on him or anything like that. I'm actually a fan of Grant Cardone. I think he's a brilliant businessman, and I actually have his book, 10X Rules, and I highly recommend it. But what I'm talking about here is his agenda is different from yours and mine. Guy has a $1.2 billion net worth, right? He has corporations that own hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate. He doesn't need to own a property for him to live in, right? His corporations own property all over the country, all over the world probably, and he can live in whichever one he chooses and write it off as a business expense. Most of us aren't in that position, right? And furthermore, does he have an agenda? I don't know. Given that most of those properties are rental properties and he's trying to get people to rent at some of his properties, I mean, I'll let you decide whether or not him telling people that owning your own home is a liability, may be part of his agenda. But let's watch a little bit more.
Yeah.
The grocery store, Whole Foods. I don't buy the whole grocery store. I go get the stuff I need and then I leave. And houses were built for banks. They weren't built for people. They were built for banks. And then the people were lied to and said, oh, a house is a great investment. A house is one of the dumbest, worst investments a human being could possibly make for one reason. You have to pay the house doesn't pay you.
And there's an argument again, right, that I touched on earlier, where people are qualifying real estate as an asset based on whether or not it's cash flowing. It's a fallacy, guys. Banks offering mortgages is just an ancillary function of making homes more affordable. People didn't always have cash to buy a home, so therefore banks coming in, offering mortgages is what made it more affordable and made more Americans homeowners.
And if it doesn't pay you, it's not a good investment.
Well, not only, that, but what a lot of people don't realize, because there's so many arguments you always hear over and over again, like, when you rent, you're paying someone else's mortgage. That's my favorite one. When the reality is if you have any sort of typical loan, you're just paying interest to the bank. You could live in a house, you could have a 30-year mortgage, live in a house for 15 years and still owe exactly what the house was worth when you bought it.
Or it could be worse.
Bit of an exaggeration,
So,
right? But I
what we
touched
know
on
about
that.
houses is the bank's going to make if the loan's 6%, the bank's going to make 6% on the loan every year for 30 years.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that number is, 180%. So that means your house has to go up 180%. No. The down payment has to go up 180% for you to ever catch up with. The house has to go up 180%. The bottom line is, take all the math away.
And what he's talking about here, guys, I think where he got discombobulated, there's a school of thought, and it's an investor mindset, right, of your return on your actual down payment on a property, not necessarily the return or the appreciation of the overall property, right? So for example, you're buying a $500,000 house, you put $100,000 in it, you want to measure what your return is on the $100,000 that you invested. The average person isn't going to do that, right? Because it takes discipline, right? It essentially says, hey, at the rate of return I'm getting for the house or the real estate that I'm going to buy, I can make a better investment and get a higher return in some other vehicle, whether it be stocks, bonds, a business, etc. And like I said, I don't want to get into the weeds with that analysis because that needs its whole other video. What we're addressing today is simply the question of whether or not your primary residence owning real estate is an asset or a liability. And clearly, I think Grant is helping us make the case that we know that it's an asset. So what's today's lesson, kids? The bottom line is, I love real estate, and so should you, right? If you ever have the opportunity to purchase and own your own home, do it. If you found value in this video, like, share, subscribe. Thank you for watching.